Are you strategic? The answer can make or break your business. Welcome to Strategic Minds, the podcast where we'll do a deep dive into conversations with extraordinary leaders and world-class performers to learn how they think, plan, and act strategically. I'm your host, Rich Horwath, author of 8 books on strategic thinking, including my newest book, Strategic. And my vision is to teach the world to be strategic. Now, let's explore Strategic Minds.
We're stuck.
What do we do? I have no idea.
You need a new strategy.
We need a more dynamic strategy.
The strategy?
You have to strategize.
But you won't strategize.
Let's talk a little strategy.
Welcome to Strategic Minds. I'm excited to chat with my guest today, Geoffrey Moore. Geoffrey's one of the most influential voices in go-to-market strategy and innovation over the past 3 decades. He's the author of landmark books that have shaped how leaders think about market transitions and technology adoption, several of which include Crossing the Chasm, Inside the Tornado, Dealing with Darwin, Zone to Win, and most recently, The Infinite Staircase. And for those of you watching on YouTube, here are some of the books I've had in my library for a long time. We're going to put links to these into the show notes. So if you don't have them, I'm going to highly recommend these books from a thinking perspective, and we'll talk more about them as we move through. But Geoffrey's frameworks have guided executives and entrepreneurs in navigating disruptive change, managing innovation portfolios, and aligning organizational structure to market realities. He's a managing director at Geoffrey Moore Consulting, where he's a sought-after advisor and speaker, having counseled many of the world's leading technology companies, including Salesforce, Microsoft, Intel, and Google, on strategy and transformation. Geoffrey, thank you for being on the show today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Rich. Thank you for having me.
Yes, as I said in our pre-call, it's like being a kid in a candy store for me. I've followed your work for many, many years, and you've given us a lot of great food for thought in looking at innovation, looking at strategy, and transformation. So really excited to dive in today.
Good, let's do it.
So let's begin with your origin story. Please share with us where you grew up and how that environment and the people there shaped who you are today.
Yeah, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I went to private schools my whole life until the University of Washington for my PhD. And I think that did shape me a lot because it was very individualistic attention. I was kind of a bright little kid, and I got a lot of chances to do that. And so that was, I think, a big deal for me. And then I was at Stanford during the 60s, and I think the shaping thing there was the Vietnam War protest era, and I became involved with that as well. And that, I think, sort of helped. I grew up in a Republican family. I'd never met a Democrat until I went to college. So it was a very interesting transformation for me to kind of go through that.
Right.
But I did, and I think it's fun. And then I eventually married in Palo Alto, and Maria and I then went to Seattle for my doctorate, and I was an English professor for a while. And then when we decided to move back to California, there were no jobs in academics, and that's when I got involved with the software industry.
Excellent. And you mentioned being an English professor starting out. I wasn't aware of that as I read some of your earlier works. Maybe you could share with us a little bit on how that start influenced some of the thinking and thought process and writing that you did further on down the line.
Oh, I think it's at the center of it. So basically, what literature professors do is they care a lot about stories. We call them narratives, but they're just their stories.
Sure.
And what you begin to realize is that storytelling is humanity's superpower. It's how we explain everything. And fiction just is like a laboratory because you can make up stories in fiction. In history, you have to tell what the actual story was. But then you get involved in business and you realize, well, but every venture pitch is a story, right? I mean, it's just a set of slides telling a story. Every annual plan tells a story. Every earnings call tells a story. You know, every personnel review tells a story. And what you learn about when you study literature is you learn about, well, how do you tell the difference between kind of a plausible story and an implausible story, one that is potentially opening up your mind to possibilities versus a story that's intentionally trying to close your mind. And right now in our political environment, we have a lot of people who are trying to close people's minds with stories, which is a very unattractive, unconstructive thing to do. And so I think actually literary criticism right now is incredibly important given the liberties that people are taking with truth in their narratives.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that makes perfect sense too. Now, as I think about the volume of work you've done, and as a thought leader, it's one thing to come out with ideas, but you've been so prolific in sharing those ideas and making them understandable and digestible for the everyday leader, which I think is one of your superpowers. And so I'd like to then think about that idea of the narratives and storytelling and transfer that then to frameworks. As I've read your books over the years, I see you as a master at taking very complex things that can be very complex, and then really helping make them not necessarily simple, but understandable and easy to apply. Maybe you could share with us a little bit of your thinking on what defines a framework and why are frameworks really helpful for leaders as they move through their jobs.
Yeah, no, it's really important. And by the way, I think the transition then from English was, in English, you do literary criticism as a way of trying to take a complex piece of work from Shakespeare or Tolstoy or whoever it is, and try to make it digestible and understandable, maybe to an undergraduate who's just coming in. So I think the framework, I think that's where the frameworking came from. But frameworks in general for business, in business, if you have a lot of data and you have a lot of history, it's pretty forecastable. You don't need a lot of frameworks. You can sort of say, okay, I can incrementally build my annual operating plan. But when disruptive innovations enter into the marketplace, you're confronted with a situation where you have to make high risk, low data decisions. And high risk, low data decision making is where frameworks come in, because all a framework really is it's the synthesis of a pattern recognition. We've seen this a few times before. We're going to try to capture the pattern, and that's what I try to do with each of the books. I try to look at a challenging, high risk, low data situation and say, okay, what are the patterns we can distill from this? And then the framework says, look, it's not going to solve your problem. You're still going to have to think it through. But here's a language you can use that you can also use with your colleagues to try to get on the same page. And then you can use it to assess the dynamics of your situation to say, well, how much of this framework predicts what we think is really going to happen versus no, our situation's a little bit different. It's not going to play out quite that way, but at least it gives you something to work with, because in a high risk, low data decision, you have to make a decision. You can't just opt out. So that's what it's for.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And when you talk about the decision-making piece, one of the areas that I see executives at all levels wrestle with is the idea of making trade-offs. And, especially in your work, as we look at disruptive innovation and organizations crossing the chasm back from your 1991 book, one of the things I think leaders still struggle with is that risk reward, trying to make a decision without enough data and waiting maybe too long to make a decision till they have more data. How do you counsel leaders on that risk reward and being able to make trade-offs that really involve real strategy?
Well, that's kind of where I think the Zone to Win book kind of comes in here. And this was a book that was written with the team at Salesforce, with Mark Benioff's team, and the team at Microsoft with Satya Nadella's team, and a guy named Chi Lu, who's just amazing. But the point about the zones is each zone advocates for a different risk-reward trade-off. So the productivity zone is relatively low risk and modest rewards, but you get efficiency. You don't get competitive advantage necessarily, but you get efficiency and scalability and compliance with regulation is great. The opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the transformation zone, super high risk, potentially very, very high reward. Think of what Steve Jobs was able to do at Apple with music and then iPhones and then iPads, but typically requires a charismatic leader to initiate. Now, the transformation zone also becomes important if you're a company, you're not the first mover, but if you don't move sooner or later, you're going to get moved out. And so that's another time. Even in that transformation, like what the car industry is going through with electric vehicles, it's still a high risk, low data decision process. So very, very challenging. And then the other two zones, the performance zone, which is kind of more of your business's core business, again, it encourages more risks in the productivity zone. You want to grow. You want to take competitive risk. You introduce new products. You enter new markets. Those are relatively high risk. But there's some data. So it's kind of like, in that. And then the incubation zone, which is designed to take very, very high risks, but in a very contained, and therefore it's actually low risk in the sense that you can constrain the problem and the market and differently. So the point about it is, I try to spend time with people saying you need to zone your enterprise because each zone has a different success model and a different operating model. And
Yeah.
so you don't want to have the initiative cross zones. And the leadership style is different in each zone. So I spent a bunch of time with that.
Yeah, that's again, for the leaders listening out there, I really want you to go back and to listen to that part again, because what Geoffrey just shared there is something that I think a lot of us struggle with. It's not using the same formula over and over again. And Geoffrey, in the book, you describe, it requires different metrics, different playbooks for those different zones. So I would encourage all of you out there listening and watching to really think about, are you moving through those zones with different metrics, different play, to Geoffrey's point, different leadership styles potentially as well, because we don't want to take that cookie cutter approach depending on where we are. And I think, Geoffrey, that's one of the things that stands out about your work is just that you talked about earlier, that pattern recognition, that understanding of context before we start to make decisions, and especially before we start to set strategy. And to build on that, when we think about strategy over the last 20 years or so, research shows there's about 91 different definitions of strategy out there. I know you've helped lots of leaders over the last 30 years or so develop strategy as they approach different markets. What is your definition of strategy in simple terms, and how do you counsel leaders to think about it?
Well, I think the two CEOs that have had the most impact on me with strategy are John Chambers at Cisco and Mark Benioff at Salesforce. John had a very simple model called vision, strategy, and execution.
Okay.
Mark's is a little bit more complicated. It's vision, values, methods, obstacles, and measures.
Yep.
But in both cases, there's a kind of a three-part movement where the first thing is the vision part's like, what outcomes are you in service to? Like, what are you trying to do in the world that you're trying to accomplish? Yeah. And that's, let's park that as vision. And then strategy is, okay, so given your analysis of the current situation, what's the best path to achieve those outcomes? Where can you align with the powers that will help you? And how can you either avoid or counteract the powers that will resist you? And so you need to understand the landscape. Strategy to me divides up into a situational analysis and then an execution, a way of acting within the situation. But analyzing the situation, you said context. That to me is that's where I can add a lot of value, because I'm not immersed in the context of any given company. And so I can be a pretty good sounding board and I can question the context stuff. So that's the context. And so the first part of strategy is context. The second part of the strategy is, okay, where do I apply force to have, it's like where's the fulcrum? Where's the place if I apply force, I can have the most impact going forward. And then the third part is execution. And that gets into this issue of like the zones and the metrics and the measures and whatnot, making sure that you're applying the right metrics. Because we just talked about those zones. Each zone has a different set of metrics. The metrics that measure success in any one zone create failure in the other three. So I mean, it's really, really important that you're not do a cookie cutter, because you're going to cut your hand off, not your cookie off.
Right. Have you observed what companies have you observed that have done a good job over time managing the transitions from the different zones? I could see organizations, and we've got examples where they're able to do it once, but being able to do it consistently over time, to me, starts to separate the really intuitive, foresightful leaders out there. Any examples that you could share around companies that have done it over time to be able to continue managing those transitions?
I mean, yeah, I mean, one is a disruptor and one is a disruptee. I was in Seattle for my doctorate work. I'll pick two Seattle companies, Amazon and Microsoft. So Jeff Bezos systematically, continually re-examined the situation of the consumer delivery chain.
Yep.
And basically, it started with just books on the internet. But and then it went to retail, and then it went to Kindle and electric books, and then it went to this Amazon website. But in every case, he was looking at the system, going, "There's a better way to do this," and he would just relentlessly pursue that. And he did that as a charismatic founder with a lot of stock, and his investors sometimes got very upset with him. But it's like, my way, I sell my stock. Right. Okay, that's one way. I think what Microsoft was able to do under Bill Gates, and Ballmer doesn't get any credit, which is not fair. Gates and Ballmer and now Satya, they've never been the disruptor. They've always been the fast follower.
Yeah.
But they've been amazing at fast following. So, the Novell, local our networks, well, we did NT. Well, but what about Lotus 123? Well, we did Excel. Well, what about WordPerfect? Well, we did Word. Well, what about the Netscape Navigator? Well, we did the Edge browser. Well, but what about Amazon Web Services? Well, what about Azure? I mean, it's like, holy smoke. And so that ability to, and they did it largely. It's interesting if you contrast the two. Microsoft is very responsive to competitive behavior, competitive threats. In fact, they taught me the phrase existential threat, which is like, okay, that was very cool. That's very motivating. I think Amazon and to some degree, I think more Salesforce, they're more oriented toward customer value traps. And how do you essentially release trap value in the customer's environment? Either one of those can be highly motivating for vision, and then that leads to strategy and execution.
For those leaders not familiar with the customer value trap, maybe you could just expand on that for a moment.
Yeah, if you spend any time around venture capital, and I spent like 25 years with Moore David Dow and another venture firm called Wildcat Ventures, what you realize is that venture capital invests in technology innovations that can release trap value. That's where the ROI is going to come from. So what's artificial intelligence going to do? It's going to release trap value. Well, where? Well, in the education system, it's going to do it with tutoring. And within the healthcare system, it's going to do it with diagnosis. Or it's going to do it with appointment scheduling. Or it's going to do it with supply chain optimization. Or wherever you see in your business, in your operating model, that there's a gating bottleneck. The idea of trap value analysis is find the bottleneck and then look at the technology portfolio that's on the market and say, is there some technology that could help us release that trap value?
Excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful. I want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who's been sharing the Strategic Minds podcast. Your support is what helps us grow and reach more leaders who want to think and act strategically. If you've been finding value in these conversations, I'd love for you to follow in their footsteps. Share the podcast with a few friends or colleagues in your network who you think would benefit from becoming more strategic in their work. Your word of mouth makes all the difference, and I truly appreciate it. And you talked about the operating model. We've talked about business models before as well. Maybe you can share with listeners a little bit of your perspective on the difference between business models, operating models. I think sometimes people get a little bit confused on, which ones to look at. There's infrastructure models as well. Share with us your perspectives on those and when we should be thinking about those and potentially evolving them.
Right. So when I think of it as a pyramid a bit with business models at the top,
yep.
And then the business model gives rise to the operating model, and the operating model gives rise to the infrastructure model.
Okay.
Most of the time, the business model stays the same. To change the business model, you really are changing the value proposition, the customer base, the entire thing. So, yep. For example, Apple's business model changed when it went from Macintoshes to iPods and iTunes. That was a complete change in business model. Yep. And then when they went to iPhone, it was another change in business model. But when they went to iPads, it was not. iPad was essentially the business model of the Macintosh. It was just a different product line within that. So that's business model. I would say most companies, most of the car industries, even though the car industry is going through enormous revolutions, their business model is not changing. Their operating model is changing dramatically. Mm-hmm. But and I would say same thing with financial services, same thing with healthcare, same thing with education. Their business models haven't changed, but their operating models have to change because of the digital transformation. So the operating model is where we spend most of our time. Now, the operating model, if you're going to scale it, is ultimately going to depend on the infrastructure model. So right now we're having this huge AI, training data center, AI factory build out thing, whereas $1 gazillion is going into capital investment in AI factories. That's an infrastructure model change that's being driven by the fact that this is a whole new business model, a whole new operating model that's coming on very, very rapidly, and we're trying to kind of catch up to it. For most people, the infrastructure model is necessary. You have to alter your infrastructure. Like the taxi cab people had to alter their infrastructure model in order to emulate the operating model of Uber and Lyft. Mm-hmm. And by the way, General Motors and Mercedes and Porsche are going to have to change their infrastructure model in order to do the operating model, particularly for distribution of cars. So because Tesla said, look, we don't need the dealership model the way you got. We don't have to have all that inventory at the dealer, et cetera. So that has big impact not only on their operating model, but on their infrastructure model.
And how often would you recommend leaders take a deep dive into the operating model and the infrastructure model? Is that yearly? Is it more frequent than that? What's a best practice that you would share with folks?
It's not more frequent. I think the one to always watch for is operating model. Because I think the business model one's pretty visionary and the infrastructure model is pretty technical.
Yep.
But the operating model is kind of where most business leaders, and the thing that you should always, I think it's worth asking every year is to say, where is the trapped value in our operating model this year? Because last year we worked on this initiative and we actually released some trapped value and we got better at doing X. But it's a little bit like a highway manager. We added a lane between, city A and city B, but now everybody's bottled up, at city C. So where's the trapped value now? And for maybe, we're still working on the same value trap because you don't get rid of them in a year. So it's like, okay, we're in the second year, the third year. But by the way, if you're working on it for 3 years, what the hell? Something's wrong here, people. We need to either we're just beating our head against the wall or we're not being as effective as we need to be.
Right. And from a framework perspective, when you're looking at that trapped value, is a framework like the value chain analysis helpful there, or are there other frameworks that you would point people to when doing that type of analysis?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have done really good work with value chain, starting with Michael Porter, and then a guy named Tracy and Wiersma had one about, the value chains. And the technology adoption life cycle is another framework that I use a lot. Mm-hmm. But they're just frameworks to say, if we look at our enterprise through the lens of this framework, does it highlight where we might be trapping value? And so I kind of think of them, it's like going to an optometrist and they hold up a lens and they say, is it clearer, darker, or sharp, with this lens or that lens? And if you look at so I do think you ought to have a library of frameworks. I think you ought to bring them out and kind of say, is this helping or not? And you should feel free to say, discard, discard, discard. Hey, wait, this one, maybe we're seeing something.
And as we look at these frameworks and we start to put this library together, and again, for those listening, I would highly recommend Geoffrey's books. And again, we'll put contacts in the show notes to those. It's rare to find an author and a thought leader like yourself, Geoffrey, that puts so many practical frameworks together. It's one thing to throw theories out there, and that theories are helpful, obviously, but the practical frameworks, I think, is where you've really separated yourself from a lot of people. When you think about frameworks for strategy development, you talked earlier about Salesforce and their V2 MOM model, and then Chambers with the vision strategy execution model. Are there any other frameworks when you think about strategy development? So, you talked about the importance of context, where we are, what does the situation look like, the vision, where are we going? And then strategy really being that path, how are we going to get there? What are the options for us to think about? Are there any other frameworks that you found useful over the years?
Well, and another, you said there were a lot of these books. By the way, each book starts with me trying to confront a problem that I have no idea what the answer is to. I just know that it's a problem that's causing my clients or customers grief. And so I try to, so each book delivers a framework kind of in that situation. So one of the books I think was dealing with Darwin talked about core versus context, which I still think is a very useful framework for strategy. So core is what differentiates you. It's what makes you, it's your claim to fame. It's the reason why people buy you and not anybody else. Mm-hmm. And context is all the other stuff you do. Yep. And so you should do it, but every car, by the way, has tires, 4 tires and a steering wheel. That's context. That's not core, right?
Yes.
So what you find out is that what you want to do is with your strategy discussions is take as much resource as you can from context and put it into core. You want to fund core as dramatically as you possibly can. What makes that hard is that a lot of context is mission critical, meaning you don't get a prize for doing it brilliantly, but if you screw it up, you get a big penalty.
Right.
So most enterprises find their resources trapped in what I would call mission critical context. Okay. And so being able to re-engineer mission critical context, like right now, for example, I'll give you the example that Salesforce was using last week at Dreamforce. They had an enormous amount of human resources tied up in contact centers, answering repeatable questions that frankly, they've discovered that agents can do better. So that was a situation. But what did they do? They didn't just fire people. They said, no, we're going to redeploy that resource as forward deployed engineers. So it may not be the same people. Maybe you move Mary to Harry in order to get Harry to go to Sherry. But the point is, you're taking resources out of context and putting it into core. So forward deployed engineering is part of they're trying to get everybody to become the agentic enterprise. Well, that requires a bunch of help in the customer's environment. That's what forward deployed engineering is all about. And everybody has got the challenges with data and cleaning up their data and how does this all work? And how do I handle the human factors? I mean, there's just a ton of problems to deal with. And so there's a lot of core opportunities for Salesforce if they can get people there and not have them stuck in mission critical context task work, which you can't ignore mission critical context. You must cope with it. But obviously the more efficient you can be there, the better.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that just a little bit more because I think that's a really important piece, the core versus context. One of the things when I facilitate strategic planning sessions with leadership teams, getting people to move resources from one functional area or one business unit to another sometimes is very challenging because there's not an enterprise-wide view of the business by a lot of the senior executives other than maybe the CEO and the COO. But everyone else is still kind of thinking about their own space and they're not really thinking about, well, it might be better to deploy resources to this group versus that group. And you talked earlier about the importance of incubation versus transformation, keeping things separate, different metrics and so forth. How do you counsel leaders and how do you instruct them on the importance of resource allocation and what types of principles should they be thinking about when they're thinking about where to deploy resources?
And resource allocation really is the essence. This is the deliverable from strategy, right?
Right.
Well, so it's back to the zones. One of the practices I think it's good to say is, okay, before we argue about where we're going to put the money next year, let's take a look at where we put it last year or the year before. So I would like to take last year's annual budget and zone it. How much money did we spend in the performance zone? How much did we spend in the productivity zone?
Yep.
And it could be whatever. Now, the next question is, so do we think that's the right allocation for next year, or do we think at the margin we need to put more money in one zone? And let's not worry about where we're going to take it away from yet. Let's worry about, do we think we're underfunding a zone? So if we are underfunding a zone, then what would be the adequate funding for that zone? And then you have to think about, okay, well now how do we work it with the other three zones? Because they're going to have to make sacrifices in order for us to increase the funding over here. The next thing is, don't compete for budget across zones. That's where everybody gets into trouble. I have an incubation project. Somebody else has a productivity zone project. Well, the ROI from here is immediate. Well, the ROI from here may not even have an ROI.
Right.
It's like fish and frogs. So you want to compete for budget within a zone, but not compete for budget across zones. That mistake is made virtually routinely every single year. And it causes kind of muddied compromises that are not, you get into that peanut butter effect. Brad Garlinger houses metaphor about Yahoo, but we did the peanut butter manifesto. It's like that peanut butter happens when you try to compete across zones for budget.
Yeah, that's a really powerful concept. And I love the fact that you shared that zone the budget. And, I just wrote that down and highlighted it because I think that's a unique way to think. And especially as we get into a new year and we're planning and thinking, we've got to think in new ways. So, I think your point there, Geoffrey, about zoning the budget is a great new way to start to stimulate some different thinking. How do you encourage leaders or maybe there's a framework that you use with leaders to start to stimulate the insight that lead to either the decision to innovate or to be a fast follower? Are there any things that kind of jumpstart or catalyze the process from a thinking standpoint when you're first engaging with groups?
I mean, first of all, I think it's a huge difference between whether you're dealing with a startup, entrepreneurial, venture-backed company or an established enterprise.
Sure.
And increasingly, I would say in the last 10 years, I'm spending more time with established enterprises. Mm-hmm. In the first part of my career, it was much more the other direction. And I spent a lot of time in the tech sector. So they're super exposed to disruptive innovations all the time. Mm-hmm. But the first thing I'm saying is, look, there are at least 4 core constituencies that you're in service to. Your customers, your employees, your workforce, your partners, and your investors. Mm-hmm. And most public companies over-rotate to their investors. And as a result, they make decisions which compromise their other 3 commitments. There's only one correct sequence, in my view. Mm-hmm. Customers have to be first. The workforce has to be second.
Yep.
Partners and investors, I probably would put investors third and partners fourth. Okay. But if you put them in any other order, you're going to make mistakes. Because in particular with investors, the thing you have to remember about investors is your company is a financial instrument in their portfolio.
Right.
And their job is to get it in or get it out, depending on your financial performance by their metrics. God bless. That's what an investor does. And you better respect that or you won't have any investors. Right. But to be in service to that? No. You're just being a fly at the end of their fly rod. No. You need to be in service to your customers. And so therefore the question I try to get people to answer first is, what do you think the world, meaning particularly your customers, what do you think the world wants from your company next year? Mm-hmm. And are you in service to those objectives? Because as opposed to, are you trying to squeeze another penny per share out of earnings per share? I mean, please do, but your reason for being is, what is the world? What are you giving to the world? What does the world want from you? And one of the things you discover if you're an established enterprise is the world does not want you to be a disruptor. I mean, if you are, you are, but that's not what they're looking for. What they want you to do is to keep up, because they have an established relationship with you. It's working. It needs to be better, of course, but it's working. They don't want to change vendors, if you don't keep up, they have to. And so what they want you to be is a fast follower, and that's why I'm so impressed with Microsoft and their ability to do that. And even though it's not motivated as much by the customers as by the competitor, it's still, from the customer's point of view, the fact is they are now the enterprise cloud. AWS nailed cloud in a way that none of us could even have imagined. And they're still, to me, the thought leader of cloud computing, probably always will be. But Azure is amazing in what they were able to do for the CIO. And now Google is coming along and saying, we think we can do it for hyperscalers or for another group of people that are playing the game. So in all three of them, but the world wants something very different from Google than it wants from Microsoft. And it wants something different from Microsoft than it wants from AWS. And so I think it's important to say, what does the world want from my company, given who we are? Like right now, Irving's trying to figure out, what does the world want from IBM? And frankly, it's not obvious. I mean, there was a time when IBM was the only computer company that anybody thought anything of. Right. That was the beginning of my career. But he's been dealt a tough hand. And by the way, now we have, CPU at Intel. What does the world want from Intel? I mean, look, NVIDIA has been the AWS of AI chips. That horse has left the barn. So it's a fast follower game. So how do we get Intel back in the game? How does Cisco stay in the game? With the hyperscaler, how does HPE or HP Inc., how do they stay in the game? How does Dell stay in the game? I mean, it's every year it's like, we don't want those companies to go away, but we do need them to keep up.
Yeah, that's a really valuable question. What does the world want from you? I think that's one, again, for every leader listening out there, that's one I think to jot down and sit down with your team and really think through and work through. You talked about, Geoffrey, the fast follower. And I still run into organizations today where it's all about innovation, and fast following almost is looked down upon, even though you described beautifully the Microsoft example where they've been super successful using that approach. Do you recommend, or are there guidelines that you would share on being a fast follower? Are there things to look for or to do that can help someone excel in that role?
Well, first of all, why is there no charm in it? Well, if you're in the incubation zone, nobody in the incubation zone wants to be a fast follower. Right. And the whole point of being in the incubation zone is I get to try cool new stuff. Yes. And by the way, there's no career path in the incubation zone. So you better be entrepreneurial. You better be ready to play that game. Yeah. But I think if you ask the question, what does the world want from us? The world wants innovation from you. It wants you to somehow assimilate a disruptive innovation, which you probably did not create, but synthesize it with the existing legacy infrastructure you have and capabilities you have to take the entire experience with you up to a new level. So it's a hugely creative enterprise. It's not egotistical. The thing about the incubation zone is it tends to be arrogant and egotistical at the beginning, and frankly kind of has to be, because nobody's paying any attention to it. But as soon as it starts to get scale, it needs to be more humble. And what you learn about egos as you get older is the arrogant ego, actually the humble ego is a stronger ego than the arrogant ego. because the arrogant ego is being defensive because it's actually a little bit fearful. The humble ego is not afraid. The humble ego is saying, no, I know where we're going. And so I think fast following in a way is a signpost of the humble ego. And not to say that it can't get arrogant as well, but that's kind of the path I would think of.
One other thing I'd like to unpack, because you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's another challenge organizations face. You talked about the importance of customer, workforce, investors, and then partners. And there's a number of organizations that still struggle with that order, so to speak. How do you, when you look at a company that does it well, is that culture driven? Is it top down driven? Is it process driven? How do you see organizations that maybe aren't built that way initially start to adopt that approach?
Let me do the bad one first. Let me do the good one. The bad one is, how do you get stuck in some other order?
Yes.
So, for example, if you're a collaboration culture, you tend to, first of all, you're very collaborative with your customers, and that's very welcome. But you also tend to be very conflict avoidant with your colleagues. So you tend not to hold your colleagues as accountable as you might, and you kind of let things slide, and you try to make things easier. So all of a sudden, when you see an employee-centric, when a company that puts their workforce first, is you start getting into issues around entitlement, and then you get issues around, and basically the customer gets more and more pushed to the side as we worry more and more about currying favor with the workforce. That's not okay. Lack of accountability is not okay.
Yep.
Not being in service to the customer, that's not okay. So that's how that one happens. But it can happen. And over time, I would say in all bureaucracies, it has happened. All governmental bureaucracies, it has happened. In many educational bureaucracies and healthcare bureaucracies, it has happened.
Yep.
And so it's problematic. And by the way, once you're there, it's very hard to get out of. Because the entitlements become self-perpetuating, and you start attracting a workforce that reinforces the entitlement culture, and it gets harder and harder and harder. So there are just some companies you just can't turn around. I mean, you just can't.
Yep.
And so, and by the way, a company does not need to be immortal. Okay, I mean, if you can't turn it around, you can't. Then if you go to the investor, we've talked about the investor. If you rotate to the investor, now you're underserving potentially either your customer or your workforce. And that's just, that in the short term will create a great exit. That's what private equity people do. They take a kind of a mediocre company, they beat the heck out of its short-term Horizon 1, Horizon 2 opportunities. They make it fast performing on the surface, and they sell it to the next person. But it's not a better experience for the customer. It's not a better experience for the employee, and it's a temporary. It's frankly a drug. It's the private equity. Pump. It's not pump them and dump them. It's repair them and sell them before the warranty expires. And so now if you go back to the first one, it's like the practice is you've got to use, and this is back to storytelling and narrative. You have to be able to tell a story to your company, to the people inside your company, that inspires them to be in service to whatever outcome in the world you want to be known for and to achieve. And you need to get people who are equally enthusiastic about that and make that part of their experience of working at the company, so that they say, I am contributing to something, because that allows people to lean in more. It allows people to be more creative, speak out when otherwise they might not speak out, because they're involved. But you have to involve them. We're human beings. We need a narrative to live by.
Yeah, absolutely. You've shared with us a lot of great thinking and principles around the customers, around vision. One thing I'd like to tap into a little bit from your perspective is, and we talked about strategy, is competition. I still see some organizations and leaders sometimes being on one end of the spectrum or the other. One, we don't pay any attention to the competition. We focus on, what we do. And then the other end, where I see organizations being hyper reactive to what competitor activities are happening at a trade show or in the marketplace or a new pricing structure, without really thinking about, should we even react to this? How do you think about competition, and maybe there's a framework or just some principles that you use to guide leaders when they think about competition relative to the things that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, now we're back to, if I have a hammer, you're going to be a nail, because I'm going to bring the zones back in.
Good.
So if you're in the productivity zone, you want to use your competition to benchmark. You want to actually find out what are the best practices in my industry, and my competitors are going to be my benchmarks.
Yep.
If you're in the performance zone, you want to beat the competition, which means you really want to overemphasize. You want to play in as many hands where you have the winning hand, and you want to fold places where they're going to have the winning hand. And you can't become maniacal about competition in the performance zone. You have to be very clear-eyed about where are we strong, where are we weak. And so the SWOT analysis is a very good tool to use in the performance zone. Mm-hmm. In the incubation zone, that's where that sort of reacting. I went to the trade show and I saw the whatever it was. Okay, so in the incubation zone, could you just take a look at that? And maybe the first thing is, we took a look at it, no. Or we took a look at it, maybe we should do something. Some companies have a venture arm where they invest in startups as a kind of a part of their portfolio, just to keep in touch with technology innovations. That might be something you do in the incubation zone. Maybe you start a project, maybe you bring a experimental product to market, maybe you do an acquisition, but that's all in that, okay, we need to be sensitive to the fact that the world is changing. But most changes we can probably, if not ignore, kind of sideline a bit. But every so often there's one we can't ignore, and then that's the transformation zone. And in the transformation zone, then we're really now we're on the hook for saying, okay, this is the one that we've got to change with, and we got to go. But each of those zones is going to have a different. And in the transformation zone, where you pick, where you can't lose fights in the transformation zone. So in the transformation, you pick the battles you're going to win, and then you just win them. And you will sacrifice resources from any other zone in order to make sure you're victorious, because you must win the transformation battles in order to get into the new world.
Are there any recent examples of companies that you think have done a good job of outperforming, outthinking competition in that transformation zone?
Well, of course, the thing is, it's much more obvious to see the ones that didn't.
Oh, yeah.
So you look like, Nokia had 40% market share in mobile and it has none.
Yep.
You look at Google and Yahoo. You look at Netflix and what the competition is trying to do with Netflix.
Yeah.
So I think you see a lot of folks. It's the hardest battle to win, and it often is not won, because when it's not won, it's not like you go out of existence. But your stock just goes from the kind of the market cap of a growth stock to the market cap of a value stock.
Yes.
And that kind of means, okay, you are now playing out what might be a very long heritage, but we're not anticipating any new things from you. We're now just milking a cow that's increasingly aging. So in terms of the transformation, people who've done it really well, the charismatic founders who are the disruptors, yes. But as I said, that's not most leadership teams. So I'm much more interested in a leadership team who says, we're going to bring ourselves, we're going to reinvent. I spent some time with Cisco. I think Cisco's still a little bit on the fence about how successful they're going to be, but they realized that 4 or 5 years ago that one of their trap value thing was they needed to be the security plane, that the network needs to be the security plane. And they had not invested heavily. So they doubled down heavily there. And then another problem they had is, like HP and Dell, they were selling to enterprises. Now all of a sudden the hyperscalers came in. So it's like, how do we become relevant to the hyperscalers? And that's another transformation. And they have significant offerings in both of those areas. In AI, they've got over $1 billion in revenue in AI. But it's still, you'd like it to be 10 billion. And so the question is, where's it really going to go? But I think those are examples of companies that are authentically dealing with these issues. They're very, very tough issues to deal with, because it's not only your customer, not just your investors are kind of holding you hostage. Your customers can hold you hostage, and your partners can hold you hostage. Even your workforce can hold you hostage. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. One other area, Geoffrey, I'd love to get your thoughts on is your personal approach. As I mentioned earlier, you're really prolific. You've got a lot of great books, a lot of wonderful frameworks. Hundreds of tools and techniques over the years that you've shared with people. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your approach to thinking, to writing. Where does that start, and how does that process look for you?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with caring. you engage with a customer, and by the way, the reason they invite you in is never actually the real problem. So the first thing you have to learn as a consultant is whatever they say the problem is, that's not the problem. But first of all, you have to hear that problem out to its end, and you start. And then there's usually a little around the center. And you look like a doctor. Does that hurt? Does that hurt? You kind of poke it. So there's the first. So eventually, what you want to do is get to what you might call the real problem. And then when you get to the real problem, the question is, okay, and by the way, the real problem is a real problem. And you should not expect to have an answer to it. And you certainly, even if you do have an answer to it, you should not present the answer at this time. Okay. What you really want to do at this time then is say, I want to immerse myself in this situation so that I truly appreciate what's going on and the dynamics that are going on, et cetera. And so that's where you really do have to sort of open yourself up to it's not kumbaya. It's intellectual curiosity, frankly. I mean, you just want to know why doesn't this work? What's really going on? Well, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Then I think you can go back and go, okay, now how would you change that? And that's a creative intelligence thing. And I think that's my imagination at work a lot of the time. But then what'll happen is I'll come up with some idea. I'll testify it. And sometimes it's like, meh, thank you for that's not going to work. Right. But you keep probing, you keep testing. You say, okay, well that might work. And like crossing the chasm, well that might work. And so you stay with it. And then you want to execute it enough times in the world that you go, oh, actually that does work, and we should turn that into a playbook. And then you turn it into a playbook, and then that's kind of where it goes from there.
Excellent. And just one other follow-up there. You talked about immersing yourself in the situation. What does that look like? Is that a solo, isolated experience? Is that something where you're physically with the group or the company, or is it more research bound? What does that immersion piece look like?
I think it's different. I mean, for example, if you're a McKinsey or somebody, it's a research-based activity for sure.
Sure.
In the Chasm group, at the maximum, we had 8 people. It was never a research-driven. The way our research was actually done by other people, because when we would come in, the first thing they do is say, well, let me give you all these studies that we've done, because they're not helping. But the point is they helped us a ton, right? Because they gave us huge amounts of context. Right. But the other thing I think is, and so in our case, we called it catalytic consulting. So our job was to be a catalyst, not a solution, a catalyst for the solution. And to do that, you typically have to start relatively high to sort of see the sort of what I would call from the economic buyer's point of view. Then you need to go to the middle and figure out, but what about the process owners? I mean, what's it like to be in the middle of because the middle of the organization is so different from the top. Yeah. You know, things can look so clean at the top. The strategy can be so clear. In the middle, it's like cacophony. Right. And by the way, I would say initially that meant we could work with 1 or 2 or maybe 3 clients at a time, because you had to fly to their place. Yeah, you did have to be on site. I mean, I think HP probably took me to 35 sites around the world over the 6 or 8 years that we were working together. Because I would do a workshop in Barcelona, and then I'd be in Tokyo, and then we'd be in Singapore, and then we'd be in, Longview, Colorado, and, Corvallis, Oregon, whatever it was. You had to be on site. What was wonderful about today's world with Zoom and Teams and Google Hangouts, whatever, you can be with a middle manager at 9 o'clock and with a CEO at 10 o'clock and with a janitor at 11 o'clock. Yeah. And by the way, I think you need to do that in order to get a sense of where the dynamics are. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Geoffrey, I'd be appreciative if we could close our conversation today with your responses to 6 questions that I call the strategic 6, just so our listeners can get to know you on a more personal level as we finish up today.
Okay, I'll do my best. This is not my strong suit, but I'll do my best.
I love it. Number 1, what was your first job?
So my first job was, other than a part-time job as a summer job as a theater director. My first job was as an English professor, an assistant English professor at Olivet College in 1974.
Okay, excellent. Number 2, what's your favorite vacation spot?
Hualalai. It is obscenely expensive, and it's our happy place, and we will go there every year. And Hualalai is a 4 seasons resort on the Big Island of Hawaii, on the Big Island.
Beautiful. Number 3, what's one word that best describes you?
I would want it to be something around caring, humility or caring. I mean, I really do think if you can put yourself in service, maybe the phrase "in service to." I think that being in service to is really, really an important centering thing for the personality. Yeah.
Okay. What's one book that's had significant impact on your development?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think it's probably. I think it was probably. I mean, there's a lot of books. I'm going to pick a novel because I think novels got to me. And the one that just first came to mind is a Canadian author named Robertson Davies wrote a book called Fifth Business, and it just, for whatever reason, it just really, really spoke to me. But there's tons of novels that have done that. And then on the intellectual side, it's probably, well, Molecular Biology of the Cell, which is like a book that's that thick, that fascinated me and got me interested in the biology of things. And there was a book called Darwinism Evolving that was about Darwinism. I mean, periodically I would have one of those sort of intellectual, feasts.
Okay, excellent. And number 5, what's one piece of advice you'd most like to share with others that would fit on a bumper sticker?
Well, I don't know if you'd say it's something around. It's something around being. The idea is to navigate your life by being in service to something that is worthy of you contributing your life's energy to it. So, maybe it's a quote from Bob Dylan's song, "You got to serve somebody."
Yeah. That works for sure.
Might be it.
And number 6, last one. What's the most exhilarating moment you've experienced in your professional life?
Wow. I think it was okay. This is just a big. So I was at Regis McKenna, and I was a partner at Regis McKenna. I'd been a principal there. I loved being a principal. As a partner, the governance was not quite me, and I was thinking about going out on my own. And so I'm at some trade show somewhere, and I'm introducing to myself. You know how you say, "Well, hi, I'm Rich. Hi, I'm Jeff Moore." Yeah. And I said, "Oh," the guy said, "Oh, you're the Chasm guy." And I went, "The Chasm guy." Okay, that's where the Chasm group came from.
I love it. Excellent. That's a powerful moment. Well, Geoffrey, I really appreciate the wonderful tools, the tips, the techniques, the frameworks that you shared with me today. I think it's going to really help our listeners. We'll put some links into our show notes for the books that you have, as well as your LinkedIn and your website, so folks can continue to follow the great work that you're doing. So thank you so much for being my guest on the show today.
Well, thank you for asking great questions and being a great host. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any insights?
You play to win the game.
Any further insights?
You don't play to just play it.
Insightful.
I want winners.
I played the game to win.
I want people that want to win.
It's very insightful.
Our winsight, or idea for advantage today, comes from Charles Darwin, the English naturalist, who said, "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change." As you think about your business and you think about your leadership style, your performance, ask yourself, how open to change and evolution are you? We don't want to repeat the same things we've done year in and year out, the same tactics we've done year in and year out. We want to think about, how are we evolving? How are we getting better? And what are we doing differently in order to grow ourselves and our business? Thank you for listening to today's episode of Strategic Minds. I hope this conversation gave you some valuable insights that you can apply to your business and put into action. If you found this episode helpful, we'd greatly appreciate it if you'd leave a short review, maybe even a 5-star review on your podcast player. And thank you to everyone who's been sharing the podcast. Your support really helps us grow and make the world a little bit more strategic. If someone in your network could benefit from this conversation, please feel free to share it with them. If your team is ready to strengthen its strategic thinking and planning skills and get beyond the day-to-day tactical grind, visit strategyskills.com. There you can explore our workshops, online courses, strategic coaching, free Strategic Thinker newsletter, and my latest book, Strategic. You can also take your leadership development to the next level with the Strategic Fitness System, our state-of-the-art executive development platform. Until next time, remember, be strategic to be your best.